Hi, everybody. I want to talk about ADA compliance today, and ADA stands for the Americans with Disabilities Act. What we'll be focusing on primarily is wheelchair accessibility. Um, the ADA is much bigger than that. It includes provisions for vision impaired, hearing impaired. Primarily, why we'll be focusing on wheelchair accessibility is because that's the one that most directly affects the world of construction. So we're talking about accessible pathways, accessible bathrooms, stuff along those lines. So the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, was passed in 1990, one of the legacies of President George H.W. Bush. And it's kind of weird to think about it because I don't feel like 1990 was that long ago, but prior to that, there weren't really legal protections for people with disabilities. And after, it wasn't until 1990 that we said it's against the law to discriminate against people based on disabilities. And so the ADA is divided up into three parts: Title I, Title II, Title III. And Title I mostly refers to employers providing reasonable accommodations for their employees. So a place of business can't say, well, you can't work here if you can't do this thing, for the most part. We're not going to be talking about Title I too much. We're mostly going to be talking about Title II and Title III. Title II refers to accessibility requirements in public spaces, anything that's publicly funded, public transportation. If it's taxpayer funded, then it's in the realm of Title II. Anything that's private, accessibility requirements in public spaces, but privately owned, is going to be a part of Title III. And so hotels, restaurants, amusement parks, stuff like that. So Title II is going to deal with things at the federal level, state level, municipal, so city, county level. It's saying that people with disabilities can't be excluded from any services or programs or activities that are publicly funded because the building is inaccessible. That building has to be accessible. All new construction has to be free from any sort of architectural barriers that might prevent people from accessing the building. The biggest one, I would say, is having an entrance to the building, ramps or something like that. There has to be elevators. There has to be parking. Okay, those are probably some of the biggest things. And then like countertop spaces, bathrooms, stuff like that. Public institutions were not, or are still not, required to go back and completely retrofit existing buildings if they're not compliant. Anytime you come in and remodel in a certain area, that area has to be brought into compliance. Okay, Title III, and this is probably what we would primarily be dealing with, is going to regulate public accommodations, things that are open to the public but privately owned. Okay, so like I said, hotels, restaurants, amusement parks, retail stores. What they're saying is everything has to be provided in an integrated setting. You can't have, this floor of the restaurant is for people that don't have disabilities, and then we're going to put everybody else down in the basement. Okay, it has to be in an integrated setting. When readily achievable, and we'll talk about what that means, but when it's readily achievable, you're supposed to remove architectural and structural barriers. Okay? If that's not possible, you're supposed to provide some sort of alternative measure. You're required to, if you have accessible equipment soap dispensers, automatic door openers, whatever the case may be, you're supposed to keep those maintained. Okay, it's not enough to have one if it doesn't function. If you build a new structure, it has to be fully compliant with the ADA. If you do any sort of remodel, you have to bring that into compliance with the ADA. And so their definition in the ADA is, when you say readily achievable, it means that it is easily accomplishable and able to carry out without much difficulty or expense. And so that is obviously very vague. And I would say, unfortunately, it's this part of the ADA that has generated a significant amount of strong feelings with restaurant owners and business owners and stuff like that. And unfortunately, a lot of the time, issues with ADA they become litigious. And so people have been forced to bring things into compliance under threat of lawsuit, and then a lot of times the restaurant ends up closing, and then there's a lot of strong emotions about this. But I would just say that there's still a lot of places that aren't compliant, and this is the right thing to do, and it's the rule that we're supposed to have fully compliant spaces for everybody. So moving on, we'll talk about some ways to remove barriers and some common barriers that exist. So installing ramps is a really common one. I mean, every time I drive around, I see a ramp going in somewhere, be it at a school or, it's a business or something like that. One of the biggest things happening in the county right now is going around and dropping curbs, cutting out a section of the curb and lowering that curb so that the sidewalk is at the street level. There's a lot of places still in Eureka and all over the county where you have to step down to get into the street. And so if you're in a wheelchair, that's not possible. You have to jump the curb or go way out of the way to find a drop curb or something like that to get where you're going. So everywhere these are going into place at every intersection. There are very strict guidelines that govern these, and we'll be talking more about those. Doors need to be at least 32 inches clear. Okay, so that's something that can happen in places of business. Grab bars need to be installed in bathrooms. That's a pretty common and really pretty easy one, as long as there's blocking back there. That's always kind of the wild card. Within the ADA, there are some general guidelines, things that you need to pay attention to, and we'll kind of talk about some of this stuff. And then when we talk about scoping, those are the actual regulations, like you have to do this thing. Okay, so some of the general design criteria that are addressed, parking is a big one, accessible routes and ramps, stairs and elevators, doors, entrances, bathrooms, drinking fountains need to be at a certain height. These are all things that if you're a drafter, you need to be aware of. And again, I haven't said this yet, so I can't say again, but this doesn't apply to private residences. Your house that you're building for yourself, or you're building a spec home, doesn't need to comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. If you're building a restaurant or a casino or a government building, everything has to be compliant. And there are very specific guidelines, and it would be in your best interest to know what those guidelines are. Okay. Scoping requirements, those are the specific things addressed in the general design standard. So if you're constructing a building that's going to need to be ADA compliant, 60% of the public entrances need to be accessible. you have to have an accessible route from the parking, from sidewalks around the building, and from public transportation. If there's a bus stop nearby, there needs to be an accessible route. We'll talk soon about what an accessible route is. Every public restroom has to be accessible, and then at least one stall inside the restroom has to be designed per specific ADA guidelines. Okay, so the entire restroom itself needs to be accessible, and then at least one stall inside that restroom is accessible. Parking requirements are pretty commonly overlooked, I would say. They're very specifically spelled out in the ADA. If you have a parking lot with 1 to 25 spaces, there has to be at least one accessible space. If you go from 26 to 50 spaces in your parking lot, you need 2 accessible spaces. If you go from 51 to 75, you need 3, and so on and so forth. Out of, let's say you're up to 6 accessible spaces. Every one out of those 6 needs to be van accessible. Okay, and so this is the van accessible spot here. It's got a spot for parking the van, and then there's an unloading area where a ramp can drop down and a wheelchair can unload. If you've only got 25 spaces in your parking lot, that needs to be van accessible. The other thing about parking lots is that accessible space needs to have the most direct route to wherever they're going. It can't be out in the back 40 next to the swamp out the mall or whatever. Okay, it has to be close to the destination. There are very specific widths for the parking spots. So an accessible stall for a car needs to be 8 feet wide. An accessible stall for a van needs to be 11 feet wide, and it needs to have an access aisle that's 5 feet wide. The signage is really critical, and people get dinged on this a lot. You have to have that international accessibility sign, the blue sign with the white wheelchair background, prominently displayed 5 feet above the ground. And currently, there is a third-party licensed architect that's going around the county and overseeing all of the ADA work that's occurring. And everyone is complaining a lot because she didn't come to play. And if the sign is 3 inches too low, they're taking it out and they're fixing it. If the path of travel ends up having a cross slope of 2.1% rather than 2%, then they're jackhammering it out and they're redoing it. Okay, I'm hearing a lot of complaints from people, but at the same time, the county is way overdue on their ADA upgrades. And so this is what happened. They were mandated to hire a licensed architect to go around and inspect all this stuff. And there's a lot of headaches right now with a lot of this stuff. So it's important to understand these requirements. Ramps, I think it's important to know that ramps and paths of travel are different. So keep that in mind. Let's focus on ramps right now. Ramps are generally just for getting people in and out of a building, or primarily in and out of a building. Okay, but not like necessarily to and from places. If it's a ramp, it can slope at 8.33%. That's the max. Okay, and 8.33% is kind of a weird number, but the 1-to-1 ratio is really easy to remember. So for every 1 foot of run, you're going to go up 1 foot vertically, maximum. Okay, that's as much as you can do. So it's kind of, hopefully I said that right. For every 1 foot of run, you can go up 1 inch of rise. I think I said 1 foot of rise. That would be insane. For every 1 foot of run, you can go up 1 inch of rise. And so it's pretty easy if you're at a building and you've got 30 feet from the front door to the sidewalk. I've got 30 feet to run. I need to gain 30 inches in elevation is the most I can gain. Okay. And so maybe you can't have a direct path. Maybe you need to kind of jog back and forth with your ramp. And a lot of times that's what you see, these ramps that are kind of like zigzagging back and forth, is because they need to extend the run out in order to gain elevation. Okay. I've got some other numbers up here, 1 to 12, 4.8 degrees. These are all kind of the same thing here. The cross slope is this direction. Okay, if we're walking down a ramp, that's side to side. If we're walking down this ramp, we can't exceed 8.33% going up or down. Side to side, we can't exceed 2%. And we've got a smart level that can read percentage. It can read degrees. It can read inches per foot run, stuff like that. So we can set that when we're forming, as we're pouring, and make sure that we're not going to exceed 2% cross slope. So one thing that differs in the California ADA versus the federal ADA is that we need to have minimum 48 inches of clear space across that ramp. The federal guidelines are 36 inches, but in California it's 48 inches. Whenever there's a turn in the ramp, you need to have a 6 foot wide turning platform, okay, in order to make that 90-degree turn. You can only have 30 feet of run on your ramp before you have a landing or a turn platform. Okay, you can't have 31 feet or more of straight run at 8.33%. Every 30 feet at least you need to stop and have a flat platform that doesn't exceed 2% in any direction. Okay, and then the handrails, this is the big difference between ramps and paths of travel, is that ramps have to have a handrail, okay? And the handrail is going to be on both sides of the ramp, and the top of the handrail is going to be between 34 and 38 inches, okay? I do it myself, but there's a very big distinction between ramps and paths of travel. A path of travel or an accessible route can't exceed 5% in this direction. It's 2% either way, but it can't exceed 5%. And once it exceeds 5%, it becomes a ramp. It needs handrails. And then either way, it can't exceed 8.33%.